La Dolce Vita, the sweet life, baby, the parties, the drinking, the wild nights, the love affairs. Because if we were rich and beautiful with charming friends and glittering spectacles every night, we'd be happy, right? Right? Yes, I think we all know the answer to this one, and so too does Federico Fellini in his shocking, bitter masterpiece La Dolce Vita. Because Fellini's film isn't about seizing life or splashing away in fountains. Some people misremember it as a movie about enjoying every moment, but oh no, that kind of film it is not. Instead, there's no happiness to be found in the empty spectacle, as our anti-hero Marcello Rubini discovers far too late. He's trapped. And the film leaves open the question of whether he can ever escape. And Fellini's message is pretty clear. If you're rich, if you're beautiful and privileged and attending the greatest parties, we will burn you to the ground. So in this episode of Philosophical Film Club, let's dive into one of the greatest and angriest films ever made. It asks us 4 confronting philosophical questions, namely, can we party through a corrupt society while others suffer? Can we find happiness in pure hedonism, or are we boring ourselves to death? Is there an escape from meaninglessness and nihilism? And can a film built of scandal, celebrity, and tabloid shocks still have a philosophically resonant message for us today? We'll explore all of these questions with help from Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, the ghost of Friedrich Nietzsche, and a few other existentialists piled into the back of our philosophical sports car. Because if there's one thing that La Dolce Vita teaches us, it's this: hell is being a Kardashian. So what is La Dolce Vita about? Well, the film opens with possibly the most absurd shot ever to grace the start of an art house film. It's a flying Jesus. Or rather, a helicopter flying to the Vatican, carrying both Jesus and the protagonist of our film, the tabloid journalist Marcello Rubini, who immediately tries to pick up some bikini-clad vixens on a rooftop pool. Now, some pretentious academics will tell you that the opening is an ingenious scene that immediately references Rome's imperial glory, its Christian past and its modern present, the pillars of Italian identity, if you will. But really, it's just the kind of surreal joke that Fellini relishes. He was Monty Python before Python. And this opening tells us 2 crucial things. First, we meet Marcello Rubini himself, who is something of an existential anti-hero, a tabloid journalist and a morally troubled pleasure seeker. But second, it also says that nothing is sacred. Not the Vatican, not Jesus, not Roman high society. Everything is up for dissection by Fellini's ruthless gaze. And that lavish high society, its money, hypocrisies, aristocracies, its privileges, its meaninglessness, will stand in for elites and oligarchs everywhere, not just in Italy. The plot itself unfolds as 7 or so evenings and dawns, documenting different layers of privileged, prosperous Rome. There's the first night, and a fancy nightclub. We meet Marcello again, bribing the maitre d' for gossip about Italian princes and their escorts, because he is a gossip colonist documenting the high life while yearning for a little taste of it himself. He meets Maddalena. They pick up a prostitute, not for sex, but to use her room for an assignation, and then returns home at dawn to find his fiancée has tried to commit suicide. Because, for Marcello and the others, the consequences of their decadence always arrive at dawn. The price, too, is often borne by the most innocent characters in the film, and Marcello, chastened by his lover's despair, comes so close to swearing off the sweet life that is slowly poisoning him, until the next night arrives and its temptation, and he's inevitably called back. Because the second night is probably the sequence everybody remembers from this film. The international actress and sexpot of the time, Anita Ekberg, plays the international actress and sexpot Sylvia, arriving by plane to a rapturous crowd and immediately tiring out all the journalists, except our dogged reporter, Marcello, by climbing the steps inside the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral. Here they have another shockingly unsacred encounter, Marcello almost stealing a kiss from the superstar before she is distracted by yet another entertaining event. She dances wildly at a nightclub seemingly set up in the ruins of the baths of Caracalla, managing to be decadent both in ancient and modern Rome at the same time. She quickly tires of her husband, a drunken superstar himself, and Marcello whisks her away. It seems like our playboy is about to strike it lucky again and live out his dreams, but no. Sylvia moves through the world with a childlike impulsiveness, firstly demanding Marcello bring her food, then milk for a kitten she's found on the streets, then abandoning the kitten she loved so passionately a minute ago, and finally dancing in the Trevi fountain in that iconic scene. They kiss, but then the spell is broken. Sylvia is taken back to her hotel and Marcello earns a beating for his trouble. Once again, at dawn come the consequences. Now, night 3 is something completely different, but no less shocking. Marcello and his fiancée drive to the outskirts of Rome to cover a miracle. The Madonna has been sighted by 2 innocent children appearing to them near a tree. But the scene has devolved into a media circus with dozens of lights and scaffolds and cameras set up by journalists and camera crews directing the scene, and a crowd of thousands hopeful to catch a glimpse of the sacred, including lots of sick and injured people desperate for a miracle. The children arrive, but nothing appears, and as the crowd gets wilder and wilder, the children panic, pointing out the Virgin Mary over here and over there and everywhere. The cynical Marcello is disgusted. The crowd strips the tree of every branch and leaf for sacred relics, killing it in the process, and then trampling a small, innocent child. On the 4th night of the film, we get a visit from Marcello's father, who wants to have a good old time at the Cha-Cha Club. He wants to flirt. He wants to drink. He tries to recapture his youth with a woman Marcello seems to know intimately. But his heart gives out. He flees on the next train home in the unflinching light of dawn, leaving Marcello once again alone with the consequences of his chosen life. On the 5th night, at a Roman castle full of bored aristocrats, Marcello reunites with Maddalena, who confesses her mad love for him before pretty much immediately abandoning him for someone else of her own class. He's then seduced by another aristocrat during a séance. At dawn, they all trudge down to the chapel and the noble family leaves to atone, but not Marcello. The 6th episode of the film centres on the murder-suicide of Marcello's intellectual friend Steiner, an utter tragedy. Marcello helps the police and he volunteers to tell Steiner's wife, who has no clue any of this has happened, but they're hounded by the paparazzi in a heartbreaking scene. And Marcello, seemingly sickened beyond measure by this decadent lifestyle and the harsh realities that it either exploits or it covers over, quits. And in the last evening of the film, an older Marcello returns as a publicist, this time drunk and bored, at a house party. Someone strips to celebrate the divorce, the party turns nasty, and they're kicked out. Instead, they wander a nearby beach at dawn, where the fishermen haul a monster in from the sea. Marcello collapses on the shore, bored and perhaps doomed. He sees a small ray of hope. A young girl further along the beach who talked to him during a brief interlude in the film and had a genuine moment of happiness with her. She tries to talk to him again too and perhaps rescue him, but he cannot hear her. She smiles and the film ends. So let's first talk about the society that La Dolce Vita portrays, because you may not have failed to notice that while we follow one protagonist through a series of episodes, we're given almost a survey of Italian society as it stood in 1958. We see the newly rich and wealthy, riding an industrial and luxury goods boom that was unleashed in Italy after the Second World War. Or more accurately, we see their husbands and their various mistresses at nightclubs, restaurants, and the hotspots of Rome, what the Sopranos would call their gumars, if you like. We also see the old money and the aristocrats mixing in, or alternately staying at home and entertaining on a grand scale in their ballrooms and their ruins. We see the new international intelligentsia when we go to Steiner's house. It's full of poets and musicians and countless pretentious artists who tell us it's better to burn than to freeze, whatever that means. We see the poor and the faithful when they congregate for a miracle on the outskirts of Rome, and we briefly see the underbelly of Roman society during Marcello and Maddalena's outing with a prostitute. Critically, we see the crowd of the Via Veneto, a famous Hollywood-like street in the centre of Rome. We see the movie stars, the producers, and the hangers-on, and these are all people who seem to live in the very evenings and the dreams of all of the other classes in the film when they imagine glamour. It's an image of what the sweet life really is. And this is why the film was so scandalous. Because in each episode of the film, we see a particular class's form of the sweet life. And Fellini also unflinchingly shows us the suffering and the exploitation on which that sweet life is built. Usually not their own, but sometimes it is, as Marcello and Magdalena seem to be suffering pretty badly in their gilded cages. We also see inevitably that this sweet life, bought at such a high price, is extremely fragile. Indeed, it melts away every morning as the sun comes up, and the consequences have to be dealt with. And the party goers with their mussed hair and their torn gowns, who look like real fools, have to mingle amongst the workers who are turning up to do their jobs. I don't even think that this is a particularly Marxist point that Fellini's trying to make. He was never a Marxist or a communist, even though the party thrived in Italy at the time. Rather, he came from a poor fishing village on the coast, and he was utterly scandalised by the lives that Hollywood on the Tiber, as it was then called, allowed these people to lead. And Italian society, the world really, was equally scandalised by the portrait of them that Fellini drew. He was asked about it a few months after the film premiered, and he said,
Perché ti pare che io sono un tipo che a un certo momento adesso faccio un film scandaloso. Ma non lo so, non so, è vero, francamente, dopo ormai sono passati 8 mesi, 7 mesi da quando è uscito il film, io non ho capito bene che cos'è che abbia scandalizzato la Dolce Vita, o almeno non voglio capire, perché se dovessi rendermi conto che la Dolce Vita desta scandalo per il solo fatto che a un certo momento è un'espressione di un uomo libero e che ha il coraggio di guardare in faccia le cose, e se questo dà scandalo, allora le conclusioni che uno dovrebbe trarne sono abbastanza sconfortanti. Io francamente non ti so dire che cos'è che ha dato scandalo. Lo scandalo è una cosa che non riguarda il film, ma riguarda la gente che stava in platea.
Now, it might be a cliche to say that the film held a mirror up to society, but here it really does. Because Fellini built the script of the film obsessively out of scandalous articles in the tabloid newspapers. Because the flying Jesus being helicoptered to the Vatican, that happened. A bronze statue of Christ the Worker was delivered to St. Peter's Square in Vatican City via helicopter in 1950, and it was the first time an aircraft had ever landed at St. Peter's. Anita Ekberg's wild dance in the baths of Caracalla happened, although it actually happened in a nightclub and with a naked striptease. It was so scandalous and so heavily photographed that it led to arrests, films being confiscated, and a trial. All of Italy was outraged by it. The children seeing the Madonna, the subsequent media circus, and the strip tree actually happened too. And the iconic scene of Anita Ekberg dancing in the Trevi Fountain was actually based on an event that happened a few months before, when an international star danced one night in the Trevi Fountain. And that international star was, yep, you guessed it, Anita Ekberg. Apparently, she was only too happy to reenact the scene for Fellini's film. So many of the events in the film actually happened, which was dangerous, because it kind of stripped Italian society of the one accusation it could make against Fellini to defend itself, that he made it up, that he was a fabulist, and that these things could never truly happen in their Italy. But the even more bitter accusation, and really the core of the film, is that the society of the time let them happen. In fact, it was happy either to participate in them or to turn a blind eye. When asked about the scandal, one French journalist remarked,
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez du scandale de la Dolce Vita? Est-ce que c'est un phénomène authentiquement social ou est-ce que c'est une réaction
C'était un phénomène surtout contradictoire. Vous savez que certains milieux religieux ont laissé des anathèmes contre les films, car on disait que le faux miracle n'était pas que ça n'arrive jamais en Italie, et au contraire, ça arrive très souvent. La fête finale les a scandalisés beaucoup, et l'ont tout de suite appelé une orgie, que c'était la plus haute immoralité pour certains milieux religieux. Pourtant, d'autres ecclésiastiques ont loué extrêmement ce film, ont dit que c'était un film moral, des archevêques se sont compromis même pour dire qu'il fallait les voir, qu'ils dénonçaient des mots de la société contemporaine. Les aristocrates ont détesté le film car on les voyait futiles et désœuvrés dans la scène qui était bien faite d'ailleurs. La grande bourgeoisie qui adore les aristocrates s'est sentie offensée aussi par cette représentation. Aussi, le premier soir à Milan, c'était un gala très important. Le film a été sifflé, vous savez,
Oui.
Fellini a eu, je crois, on lui a attaché la figure.
Oui.
Le jour après, le public qui était là a décerné le succès plus gros au film Néant. Au contraire.
Because things were going pretty well for certain groups in Italy. The country was being internationally celebrated. Indeed, it was setting the tone through Italian culture and fashion and film. After a devastating war, the big guys like the US and the UK were finally paying attention to Italy. Although the majority of Italian society may not have liked or supported Mussolini, particularly towards the end, after the war, he ironically achieved one of his main objectives, elevating Italian culture back to the world-leading place it held under the Roman Empire. Indeed, even the studio where La Dolce Vita was filmed, Cinecittà, or the Cinema City, was founded by Mussolini. So the aristocrats, the politicians, the bourgeois, the oligarchs, and even the church were a little uncomfortable at Fellini pointing out that all of the contradictions and hypocrisies they had to ignore to keep this party going. Just as Marcello, towards the end of the film, can no longer keep ignoring everything that must be the case in order to make this hollow spectacle possible. And Fellini was a particularly difficult messenger to take it from too, because he had already built a highly successful career as a neo-realist cinema director, documenting the impoverished but noble life that everyday people of Italy's regions lived and worked and loved and suffered. The intelligentsia and the bourgeois in particular loved the highly realistic yet moving portrayals that Fellini put together of the noble savages, the common masses that they might sometimes pass on the street. One of those films, I Vitalioni, or The Boys, The Guys, even acts as a kind of prequel to La Dolce Vita, with the sensitive young Marcello-like character leaving home at the end of the film to seek adventure in Rome. But the privileged didn't like it so much when Fellini turned that neo-realism on them to document their very real experiences. As the Italian author Alberto Moravia says in an interview,
Fellini, pour la première fois, a représenté la classe dirigeante, en fait, la classe bourgeoise, appelez-la comme vous voulez. Avant, ça n'avait été jamais fait. Alors, le scandale a été créé par cette classe, qui n'aime pas être ni jugée, ni peinte, au moins en Italie. Le scandale a été véritablement un scandale de classe.
And here's where the philosophy starts to come in. Because for a class that implicitly casts themselves as enlightened, or as more knowledgeable or smarter than those they rule over, indeed that is often their justification for ruling, it stings to have pointed out that they can be just as illogical and irrational as the rest of us. And La Dolce Vita particularly stings because it also points out that while the ruling classes may be particularly comfortable, they're not particularly happy. Quite the opposite. And this is the brilliant political and philosophical reversal that is at the heart of La Dolce Vita, why it is both a shockingly political and philosophical film. It inverts the neo-realism, which is a form of cinema that often comforts its intellectual audience, because it's not farmers and labourers who are going to go and see films about themselves, it's the eggheads and the intellectuals like me. And we see how unhappy these working classes are in these neo-realist films, and we, perhaps even unconsciously, say to ourselves, oh, the poor fellows, they don't even know what's good for themselves. Thank goodness we're in charge. We'll look after them. Well, Fellini turns that neo-realism the other way around and shows a ruling class that, wouldn't you know it, doesn't know what's good for themselves either. On how the movie was received and the scandal it caused, Fellini said, quote, "What I intended to show was the state of Rome's soul, a way of being a people. What it became was a scandalous report, a fresco of a street and a society. The left-wing press played it up as headline reportage on Rome, but it didn't have to be Rome. It could have been Bangkok or 1,000 other cities. I intended it as a report on Sodom and Gomorrah, a trip into anguish and despair. I intended for it to be a document, not a documentary." You might also wonder, what impact did the scandal have on the street and the society it documented? Particularly given that the film is clearly based on events that actually happened, despite claiming not to be, and that they rebuilt an almost exact copy of that famous street in Rome to film it. Well, one of the famous paparazzi who worked the street, a word, incidentally, this film invented, one of those paparazzi said, someone makes a bitter film, and what happens? He increases tourism, for a little while at least. Because the truth is that all of this post-war prosperity and excess was about to collapse. What followed the events that La Dolce Vita exposed was the Vietnam War, civil unrest, and the worldwide student protests of May 1968, as well as the profound recessions and crises of the 1970s that were soon to come. One of the great ironies of La Dolce Vita is that the spectacle that it documented was soon to disappear, in no small part due to the condemnation and the political outcry that the film actually stirred up. Although I say just the spectacle, because, as we know, the inequality that created this spectacle still endures today. It has just found so many more ways to become subtle and unseen. But perhaps this also explains the enduring force of the social and philosophical critique found within La Dolce Vita. But let's get to the philosophers, because a class is made up of individuals like Marcello and Maddalena, and the whole kaleidoscope of the upper class characters that parade through the film. How did they find themselves in that gilded prison? An existence of complete comfort but little happiness. Well, this is where we need to talk about the philosophies of hedonism and the aesthetic experience, which literally are philosophies of the sweet life, if you like. Because hedonism is a very old philosophy, hailing all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and it literally means pleasure in Greek. In short, it's a philosophy of enjoying yourself to the utmost. But the ancient Greeks disagreed on which approach to pleasure and to life would give you the most enjoyment. One school, the Cyrenaics, believed the more pleasure, the better, and that the pleasure you experience now is much better than merely just remembering or hearing about pleasure. So they thought that you are justified in living every moment to the fullest and ditching any moment or person or task that causes you pain and boredom. Then there were the Epicureans, who were a little more balanced in their approach. They still thought that pleasure was a virtue and the ultimate point, but they also thought that you couldn't spend your life stuffing your face. You'd eventually be sick. Instead, they cleverly argued that there is overall a greater pleasure and happiness to be had in taking everything in moderation and in avoiding harm. So theirs is a more refined and balanced pleasure. You can still enjoy the finer things in life, but you have to cultivate them and pace yourself. And in the various episodes of La Dolce Vita, we see both ways of living in action. We see how the wild Cyrenaic abandon of the Hollywood stars, throwing crazy parties and running from one entertainment to the next. But this impulsive, out-of-control way of living quickly turns bitter and causes wreckage. Marcello lives it for one night with Sylvia, but greets the dawn doubled over on the pavement and beaten down. We also see the more refined approach to pleasure, the Epicurean approach, in the intellectual party where everyone drinks a little, they talk a little, they joke a little, they listen to some music. It is beautiful for a time, but as we discover, the attendees are equally bored of its hollow entertainments. Marcello also revisits this refined hedonism again at the aristocratic castle, but the second time it seems even more hollow. He has an enjoyable enough time, even a sexual assignation, but the dawn comes and the family trudges to church. The highs of this Epicureanism are never quite high enough to compensate for, the hangover in the morning. Indeed, Fellini seems to condemn both approaches to lives full of pleasure, whether in moderation or not. He condemns them both because they are always built by the sweat of some other person's brows. The poor servants, the deliverymen, the waiters, the street sweepers, the people who have to clear away the detritus in the morning. But also because, as we've seen, the partygoers are equally bored by the spectacle and eventually sickened by it. But they seem to lack enough imagination to escape it, to do something less sensual and more dependent on the moment with their lives. Which brings us to the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who lived a short, unhappy, but profound life from 1813 to 1855. He was destined to become a priest, to marry, to live a solid, bourgeois life. But through his studies, he found philosophy, and he came to despise what he saw as the hedonistic complacency of his society. He broke off his studies and engagements, and he wrote a series of philosophical and literary works that blew a hole in the ideas of his time, so much so that he's now recognised as the grandfather of existentialism. And I'm telling you, Kierkegaard, had he been around, could have written La Dolce Vita. In one of his most famous books, Either Or, he even references that favourite Fellini-esque figure, the clown. While condemning the spectacle and complacency of his upper-class society, he wrote, "A fire broke out backstage in a theatre. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world comes to an end, to general applause from wits who believe it's a joke. And not just how the world ends. I hear the Galactic Republic ends that way too." But it's a scene straight out of a Fellini film. And Kierkegaard thought of himself as that wise fool, the one who comes to tell everyone that they're living a life of meaninglessness and regret, but going unheard. And critically for us, Kierkegaard posited that there are 3 stages of life, or types of existence that we can inhabit. These are the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And the latter 2 we won't go into too much detail about, but you may be familiar with them. The ethical is the good life, following the rules, thinking of others, never quite being free, but having the certainty and the dignity of knowing that you are doing the right thing. Certainty being the key word in this ethical existence. Kierkegaard's contention in later works, however, is that eventually you're going to come unstuck. You're going to come to a tough and uncertain situation where there is no right ethical answer. This, Kierkegaard thinks, pushes you into the religious existence, and not organised religion, but its exact opposite, one full of uncertainty, where your conscience calls to you to do something, but you're not entirely sure what, or whether the action that you settle on is the right thing to do. You simply take a leap of faith and find out. So the ethical and the religious are 2 modes of being, which feature heavily in Kierkegaard's later work. But the mode of being that interests us the most, because it seems to go to the core of La Dolce Vita, is the aesthetic existence. That is the life of pleasure. And much of Kierkegaard's Either Or documents this existence, including his infamous Diary of a Seducer. And Kierkegaard thinks that the literary character emblematic of the aesthetic life is Mozart's playboy bad boy, Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni, he lives for the chase, whether it be wine, women, or song, and the consequences be damned. Don Giovanni is so confirmed in his impulsive and pleasure-chasing ways that at the end of the opera he descends into hell because of it. He truly was a Kardashian of his time. So Don Giovanni, the aesthete, the hedonist, is an iconic character because he's condemned to pinball from one sensuous episode to the next, just like Marcello does in La Dolce Vita. And just like Marcello, Don Giovanni is periodically confronted with the hollowness of the spectacle that is his life, his purely aesthetic existence. He feels the chilling hand of something, maybe the ghost of the commendatore, or of dread, or of despair. And Kierkegaard writes that this dread chases Don Giovanni throughout his life. It is the shade that darkens almost every moment, driving him to try to experience things even more vividly and intensely to drown this out. Because he knows that every enjoyment will turn sour and disappear, just like Marcello, facing up to all of those dawns. And that simply existing in a life of pleasure doesn't give meaning, or a ladder to grasp onto, or an escape hatch. Instead, the aesthete is left alone with themselves, again and again, pursuing a life that can only bring pleasure and happiness to them and nobody else. And a lot of the time, it even fails at that. This is Marcello's dilemma, the dread that is pulled up from the depths of the sea and which confronts him in that last dawn of the film. For Kierkegaard, what the individual living the aesthetic life fears most is boredom. So the hedonist's choice is to either be amused to death or to live in boredom. There's no escape. Kierkegaard writes that when we live purely in this mode, quote, "What wonder then that the world is regressing, that evil is gaining ground more and more, since boredom is on the increase and boredom is a root of all evil." It's the inability to confront boredom that drives the spectacles and the distraction that form the episodes of La Dolce Vita. And dare I say it, but it is a fear of boredom that often drives us today and leads to some quite horrible consequences. Basically, everything to do with our phones and our isolation and social media and what this has done to our communities. It's Kierkegaard's subversive claim in Either Or that boredom, or rather the aesthetic life's fear of it, that has become the root of all evil. It links a 19th century Danish philosopher, a film about a street in Rome in 1958, and our lives today. Kierkegaard even says in Either Or, and I quote, "Yet what was it that stayed the fall of Rome? It was Panis and Circenses, bread and circuses, the spectacle of celebrity and the sweet life. Fellini exposed it to the shock of his generation, and we're still in the thrall of it today." Which leads us to our last philosophical point, nihilism. Because what Kierkegaard was diagnosing in an individual and in a society in the grip of mere spectacle was nihilism. Now, nihilism is a philosophy that claims all values are subjective, that there is no truth, and that everything is meaningless. It's frequently and controversially associated with the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, as if he was kind of advocating for this approach to the world. But like Kierkegaard and Fellini, Nietzsche doesn't like and embrace nihilism, quite the opposite. He diagnoses it as the condition of a society and of the world after the collapse of many of the grand narratives that used to give life meaning. And Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Fellini tell us why. Because if we embrace the aesthetic existence, and only the aesthetic existence, then we live by the moment and by the surface. But we also know that the moment never lasts, and that everything changes so quickly. Like a star who demands milk for a kitten but then is nowhere to be found and then is off splashing in another fountain. So if nothing lasts and can hold our attention, then it's impossible to build a narrative of our lives and ourselves, which just become a series of moments, or to discern a purpose in this narrative. It also becomes impossible to believe in things bigger than ourselves because our aesthetic experience relentlessly tells us that nothing lasts. You know, it's not for nothing that Fellini's stunning film is set amongst so many great ruins. Such an existence breeds a nihilistic approach to the world, the nihilism that Nietzsche, Kierkegaard and Fellini diagnose generations apart. And it's the despair of that nihilism, that meaningless, that causes Marcello to sink to his knees on the beach. But is there an escape? Why, yes, there is. Thanks for asking. In Either Or, even Kierkegaard asks us to, quote, "simply recall that it is through sin that one first catches sight of salvation." And famously, in response to the scandalized reception that La Dolce Vita received, Fellini wrote an article called, quote, "I too am a sinner." And Nietzsche thought that there was the possibility of escape too. But his approach was controversial. It was his will to power, the attempt for the individual to pull themselves up by their bootstraps out of the muck, to make themselves into something they wanted and they willed, rather than just accepting whatever is offered at the buffet of life. Now, there's a certain type of perhaps young, perhaps male, perhaps message board posting individual who's quite partial to this worldview. For me, it's complicated, but it is something. It is a potential ladder out. Kierkegaard's escape route is even less helpful, to be honest. It's the teleological suspension of the ethical, a great philosophical term you can use to bamboozle all of your friends at the parties they won't invite you to. But what it means is a religious calling, and not in the conventional or even spiritual way, but rather an experience that is so inexplicable and yet passionately real that it drives you to do something important despite the uncertainties. And for Kierkegaard, the whole point is the risk and the uncertainty, therefore the faith that you must have to make that leap. But for Fellini in La Dolce Vita, a way out comes from a much simpler place. It's Paola, the girl he meets at the beachside tavern and then runs into again at the end of the film. She represents a simpler life, one away from the spectacle. She enjoys what she has. She enjoys the seasons, the beach, and the fact that these fishermen have just pulled a crazy creature from the sea. In a film full of characters disconnected from each other, she seems to be the only one who has a connection to both the real world and to other people. Fellini's implicit message here, at least in my reading, is that the sweet life of privilege leads us away from what is real and what matters. Our work loses meaning because we haven't had to choose meaningful work. If Marcello doesn't write his gossip column for tomorrow's tabloids, it really doesn't matter, which means he doesn't matter, which means nobody depends on him. And he's created a series of friendships united only by spectacle, by the parties he attends, instead of spending time with and appreciating the woman who actually loves him. Those who he's become attached to drift in and out of his life, and again, no one depends on him, meaning again, he doesn't matter to them and to himself. Because again, at the root of nihilism and meaninglessness is boredom. It is often boring to do meaningful work that accomplishes something. It's often boring to help people and have them depend on us. It's often boring to meet up with and listen to family and friends who tell us the same stories and have the same dull lives as us. If we live the aesthetic existence, we flee from that potential boredom. Because just like Marcello, we're often terrible at telling what is good for ourselves. Paola, gesturing to Marcello on the beach, offers for him to join her, to escape. But in an ironic parallel of the opening scene in the film where Marcello rode the flying Jesus, he cannot hear her. The question Fellini asks his audience, both then and now, is can we hear her? So that is La Dolce Vita, a bitter, shocking, beautiful, philosophical film. It was Roger Ebert's favourite film, although he said that when he would see it again at different stages of his life, he would identify with very different parts of it. When he was young, he loved the glamour and he envied the parties. When he was middle-aged and sick of Hollywood, he identified with Paul Marcello's condition. And when he was older, he loved the moments of humanity amidst the bitterness. The characters we briefly glimpse, like the prostitute, a clown, a girl growing into womanhood and working at a seaside cafe, they nod backwards at the rustic, redeeming narratives that Fellini was previously known for. But these are fleeting glimpses. The centre of the film, filling every frame, is the spectacle and the new age of capitalism embodied in Rome, in Italy, and in the world. Personally, I don't love this film. Sorry. It's spectacular and absolutely worth watching, don't get me wrong. It has some of the greatest cinematography outside of an Orson Welles or an Andrei Tarkovsky film. But it's just a little too bitter for me, particularly the Steiner episode. It speaks of a phase in life when you've had enough. But I genuinely don't believe that we can spend all of our lives within that aesthetic existence. We all get sick of it, and we all grow up eventually, even if some do a little more quickly than others. The disillusionment of La Dolce Vita is a rite of passage and well worth documenting, but it passes. The film I love instead is Fellini's next film, 8½, which is a story of how Marcello and Fellini resurrect themselves, how they rise from the burnt-out husks of their Hollywood on the Tiber existence and start taking joy in being able to be artists again, but that's for another video. And I'll always be grateful to La Dolce Vita because it also inspired one of my favourite films of all time, The Great Beauty by Paolo Sorrentino. Made 55 years later, it's a kind of response to Fellini's La Dolce Vita, and it provides the flip side of the argument. It just quickly centres on a journalist facing down the end of his own life and his career, reflecting with his friends and deciding, hey, it's been a blast. It's been pretty great, hasn't it? And he realises that the thing he's been missing for the entirety of life, that he's always yearned for, has kind of secretly accompanied him the entire time. But that is for a completely different episode of Philosophical Film Club. For now, that's it. So until next time, be wise and be kind, and try not to dance in too many fountains.